I call the honourable member David Cleandon.
Mr. Chair. Sir, we're debating part one of this unfortunate piece of legislation, the purpose. Of course, as soon as one sees a statement of purpose, which is to allow the Director-General of Department of Conservation to authorise the removal of timber. So the process which we're undertaking tonight to endeavour to embed this legislation is an offence to the democratic process. This is a significant shift in a country where we highly rate our conservation estate, where the integrity of the public domain, particularly our conservation and wilderness areas, is very close to people's heart. Jamming us through in one night with no opportunity for the public to have comment is an offence to the democratic process. It is also offence to anybody with the most basic knowledge of ecology. The content and the propositions within the legislation is utterly offensive to stage one ecology students. No doubt are laughing around the country when they read the provisions of this bill, the endeavour to rationalise it, the claims that are made within this legislation. It is an offence at many levels, sir, but I will confine my comments to the purpose for the time being. In terms of the purpose, when the purpose is stated, we've heard a number of propositions about why this legislation is going ahead, that it's ultimately a political act, and it's difficult to refute that because if one looks for a sensible, rational, logical explanation, it's extremely hard to find. We hear the language from this government a great deal of balance, needing to balance the economy and the environment, as if that's a false dichotomy at every level. Joined-up thinkers nationally and internationally know that environmental well-being and economic well-being are in fact two sides of the same coin. You degrade one, you degrade the other. If we cause harm to the natural environment, it not only affects us as human beings, there will inevitably be a negative economic effect. Joined-up thinkers know this notion of this split, that one must serve the interest of the economy or of the environment, is such dated thinking as to be laughable. And unfortunately, this bill embeds that sort of very dated thinking that probably was never right, but certainly it's not appropriate, it's not acceptable in the 21st century in New Zealand. So why then are we proceeding with this? We are told that there may be economic benefit. I wonder if any of members of the government, any members who have taken calls from the government on this bill, have actually read the regulatory impact statement, because anybody reading that document must realise that there is an underlying purpose to this bill, which is not the one which is stated. It is not about an economic well-being or an economic boost to an area where undoubtedly the economy is constantly under stress and has been as a result of centuries of extractive industries. The economic analysis contained, it's very brief because there's very little work being done. I actually have some sympathy for the unfortunate individual or people who are obliged to write this document, because essentially they were obliged to make it up as they went along. The document tells us, for example, there's an attempt to estimate what the income from the entire project may be. And they're telling us that allowing for some essentially the question of what the income would be is virtually impossible to calculate because the information is not there. They've looked at the volume of timber, the likely value of the timber, the cost of extraction, the level of opposition to the extraction, which will be significant and which will drive up the cost. And they come to figures that could be anything. This is an MPI figure, in fact. Their highest estimate of overall income, $8 million. Their lowest is $810,000, a tenfold difference in their guesstimates, because essentially that's what they are. Their guesstimates as to the likely income from this ludicrous project that's being proposed. We are told, the author of the RIS goes on to say, I'm not aware of any work that has been done to set a limit on what level of economic benefit would justify new legislation or new urgent legislation. This is being made up as people are going along, and that's an extremely unsatisfactory way to propose that we intervene in a wilderness area, in a conservation area, in a way that we know will be destructive of the ecological values, the future economic value in terms of tourism, Mr. Chair.
David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we know, for example, that MPI have warned us. This is not the Greens or Labor making things up. The Ministry for Primary Industries have raised concerns, and I quote, about the potential for a spike in supply to have negative effects on the sustainable forestry industry overall. So the existing industry can be undermined. We have no idea what suddenly putting this volume of logs on the market would do to the cost, to the price, but we can make some pretty bold assumptions. Economics 101, supply and demand. Dump an oversupply in the market, it'll very quickly drop the price. It'll drive down whatever economic value there may ever have been, in which in any case we know will not compensate for the substantial ecological value. We are told that this will provide a research opportunity. We'll be able to research the effect of removal of windblown timber from a forest ecosystem. What an interesting proposition that is. The research question would have to be, how badly would this ecosystem be impacted on by the removal of these logs? It's not a question of will there be adverse effect, it's how long will the ecosystem take to recover? Will it be able to recover, in fact, into anything resembling the ecosystem that was there prior to the cyclone, and that could, if we leave it alone, be restored in its own right? It is simply dishonest to suggest there's a need for such research. This document, the RIS, flimsy though it be, has 2 pages of references and commentary about scientific research and indeed some recent publications. We know very well species, as it tells us, are resilient to wind damage because while individual trees and indeed many trees can be knocked down, the ecosystem can come back. That is the nature of resilience. If you have sufficient diversity in an ecosystem, if you allow the system to work in its own way, to recover in its own way, it will restore itself. This is the wonderful thing about nature. It is self-restoring. An intervention of the scale that is proposed here will deny that ecosystem the ability to restore itself. You will be left with degraded land. We will take away the nutrients that are required for the regrowth. We will take away the areas where seedlings can be protected as they grow back. We will take away the habitat for the insects, for the invertebrates, for the bird species, for the mammals, which are many of them rare and possibly endangered. All of that we're going to take away for the spurious claim that it'll derive or generate economic benefit. It is simply dishonest to suggest that there is any net economic benefit from such a bizarre undertaking. We know, and the industry tells us again, clearing wind-blown timber is an extremely dangerous proposition. You do not put untrained, unskilled people into that environment because you will have serious injuries and you will have deaths. To carry through this task, to get that timber out, would require teams of extremely well-trained, experienced, well-equipped people. The notion, this idea I think people might have in their minds, because the government is trying to sell it, of a very light-handed intervention, large helicopters coming in, carefully selecting logs and removing them, is a nonsense. This would be a major intervention with heavy machinery on very fragile, delicate ecosystems. It was unfortunate. One of the works in progress is consultation, we're told, with Ngāi Tahu, and at the time the RIS was written, that was work in progress. We heard an unfortunate comment earlier this evening that Māori would understand the practical benefit of removing this resource, so-called, and I find that quite offensive. I actually think cultural harvest does have a long-term place. In the long term, there is a place for cultural harvest in our conservation estate, and that is a contested notion, and I'm willing to have that contest. I'm not suggesting at this time. The idea that Māori would accept the notion that you can go in mob-handed and start tearing out massive volumes of wood, as I said, irreversibly damaging a very fragile ecosystem, denying it the right to regenerate naturally, To say that Māori would somehow be involved in that, would tolerate that or accept it, is simply offensive again. Yes, I know back in the day the tupuna, after a major storm event, might have taken advantage of fallen trees. A tree...
I call the Honourable Member Reno Tirakatini. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair. Tēnā koutou